Okay, so this is going to be the third and final video that I'm recording to post on Omnivox on Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis. By this stage, you should all have a pretty good grasp of the story. We've spent a lot of time on it, and we've explored many different components of the story, and some of them in quite some detail. We've been asking some great questions, and we've seen how it is so multi-layered with many different avenues that we can take to discuss not just what's transpiring, but how it is significant in terms of the themes that are being explored here. And of course, no absolute answers, but a lot of possibility. So I'm going to concentrate on part 3 tonight, which we discussed in class. And as usual, pull up the text and look at specific elements of the text and the language and the words that lend themselves to the observations that we've already made. And just give you more, not just more to think about, but also, again, reminding you that whatever conclusions you draw or observations you make or claims that you want to make regarding the possibilities in the text need to always be rooted in the text itself, right? Evidence to substantiate the claims. Always essential. All right. So again, I'll try to keep this about an hour long. We'll take from there. And of course, as a reminder that for our next class, you should be reading Melville's Billy Budd, and the page numbers that you are responsible for are listed in the course outline. So please always do refer to the course outline to see where you're supposed to be and avoid falling behind, especially with our next story, novella, Billy Budd. It is fairly dense. The language is at times quite challenging, and we want to be sure that we stay on top of it. All right? So let's get this text up. And all right, so we know where we left off, right? Just as a reminder, again, a lot of this will be review of what we covered in class. These videos are meant to complement what transpires in class, especially since as I've mentioned, the recordings of the class are not converting properly into a format that can be posted. So again, the emphasis on being attentive in class, taking notes in class, and then looking at these videos as a means of complementing what we've covered in class and perhaps going into some areas that we did not get to spend enough time with. So we are now at the third stage of the story. We've been able to determine the direction that that Gregor in particular is heading. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about that theological component that we discussed in class. We covered that in pretty good detail as a possible means of looking at the story, but just to remind you how it ended in part 2 with his father throwing the apples, and the reference that up here, as we can see, again, the text gives us the evidence to be able to look into the possible theological, in this case, elements, but he felt as if nailed to the spot and spread himself out. You know, again, the suggestion of a Christ figure. And remember how that ties in with the idea of Gregor's sacrifice, the ultimate sacrifice, death, um, death of his human consciousness as well. Remember, always that dichotomy. His consciousness still remains human, but his physical being is hardly human, right? It's insect of some sort. And that striking image at the end of the mother begging the father to spare Gregor's life. Mercy. And of course, that tells us again, we've been looking at the way that the family members are transforming, but the mother always maintaining this very strong maternal attitude towards Gregor. While we're seeing the father, who never really seemed to, he was always a bit distant, but of course, with Gregor's sister and how she is moving away, right? We'll look and see how she's the one who basically insists that this is no longer Gregor, even though it is. We know that from his human consciousness. So again, always being attentive to the concept of time. When we talked about how time is very rigidly followed at the beginning, but then it starts to become less precise. The apple was lodged in his flesh and remained as if a visible reminder of his injury. He had suffered it there for more than a month. It sets us up, as we know, when we get to the end, right? From going from this sequence of time, that we are heading towards spring. And everything that comes to represent growth, rebirth, etc. Right? And we have to be attentive to how that ties in with certainly what happens with the family members and where they end up at the end of the story. We're seeing a steady demise of Gregor now, with the injury and everything else. He's lost his mobility because of the injuries, no longer able to crawl over the ceilings. Remember, that was something, as he discovered his new physical reality, what is it that he can and cannot do physically, and learning how to adjust to the new physicality. He's, as always, listening, but we're certainly separate, is recognizing this distance growing. Right? We're in this final stages here. We note as well, in terms of the transformation of the family, all of them were usually very quiet nowadays. Soon after dinner, his father would go to sleep in the chair. His mother and sister would urge each other to be quiet. His mother, bent deeply under the lamp, would sew fancy underwear for a fashion shop. The mother is working. Sister has taken a sales job. She's learning shorthand and French in order to get a better position. All right, but we're certainly sensing here, though, at this stage, even though they're working now, they're doing what is necessary, since Gregor can no longer support them. But they're certainly seemingly not enthusiastic about it, right? And their life is takes on the flavor of quite difficult. Of course, this is what Gregor's been doing to support all of them for at least the 5 years. Interesting note here how Gregor's father, now that he's working, refusing to take his uniform off. All right, and that as a result, stains on his coat, the uniform is as a representation of his new position, of a position of a kind of authority because it is a uniform. There suggests, right, an idea that he has greater capabilities, right? We think of the uniform. Where have we seen a uniform before, right? In the picture of Gregor when he was in the army. But he never takes it off. It's getting dirty. And they're still seemingly in a bad state. Right? And it's very important to realize that this is how they're being portrayed at the beginning of this section of the story. And we look at that in contrast to where they're going to be at the end. And that their final transformation, right, it's a process, is going to arrive shortly. Right? The uniform is important because it is associated with a type of authority, take charge. He doesn't seem to be using it as such at this point, but remember as we get towards the end, when he finally stands up and takes a stand and throws the tenants out and is going to tell the charwoman to leave, he's going to fire her, and he now adopts a role vis-a-vis his wife and his daughter after Gregor dies, of a leader. Right? At this stage, it's more Greta who's the leader, and yet she is still just the child. So the father has to go through this last stage, which seems to be utterly dependent on Gregor, and ultimately Gregor's death. He's falling asleep. He won't go to bed. He has to get up at 6 a.m. to work. And he's complaining, clearly indicating at this stage a discontent. What a life. This is what peace I get in my old age. So there's no sense that anything is better for them at this stage. If anything, they're looking at it as something worse. And understandably, before this, he could do what he wants. He could have his long breakfasts, not a care in the world, because Gregor was there. Gregor is no longer there, but he still is technically there. Right? This is where we get into the more of the metaphorical existence of Gregor in this family. Presence, just his presence, while he contributes nothing, if anything, is now he's moved from being the contributor to the family to now the burden of the family. And again, it comes back to the idea that they cannot move forward while Gregor is there. And we have to look at that in the context of when Gregor, before his transformation, when Gregor was the breadwinner, supplying all the money and so on, where they seemed to be fine with that. But what were they achieving? What was their purpose? We're seeing them in the process of developing towards having that purpose, whatever that purpose may be. So now that they're all working, that's a step along the way, but they're not there yet. The maid was dismissed. We're getting all this sense of everyone being in a decrepit situation. The loudest complaint was that although the flat was much too big for their present circumstances, they could not move out of it. There was no imaginable way of transferring Gregor to the new address. Can't move because of Gregor, right? It comes back to Gregor. Again, I'm stressing the irony that here they're obviously looking at Gregor as a burden, but there is the suggestion that Gregor, before his transformation, was a type of burden as well, insofar as they, in their reliance on Gregor, they weren't able to move forward as human beings, taking responsibility, making the moves that are necessary as a family unit within the confines and the structure and the parameters of societal norms. But Gregor, he could see quite well, though, that there were more reasons than consideration for him that made it difficult for them to move. Well, now we're getting Gregor's perspective. As he sees it, it would have been quite easy to transport him in any suitable crate with a few air holes in it. The main thing holding the family back from their decision to move was much more to do with their total despair and the thought that they had been struck with a misfortune unlike anything experienced by anyone else they knew or related to. All right, and it's an interesting perspective that we're getting here, that they are looking to blame Gregor. The suggestion here is that no, they have the capacity. They could put him in a crate and move him, but they're into this total despair where they can't realize that. And the suggestion there is that there are limitations. And as long as Gregor is there, they'll still use Gregor as an excuse, as opposed to confronting their despair and doing what is necessary to overcome the obstacles in place. Before Gregor's transformation, there were no obstacles which kept them from moving forward. Now that they're in this position where there seems to be a need, as there was in the past, to move forward, it's still Gregor, now in a very different way, that's holding them back. Whether Gregor is completely human as he was before the story began, or whether he is now what he is, whatever that is. It's still Gregor who is, for them, in this case, where they're angrily blaming Gregor, in contrast to before, where they weren't even aware necessarily of how Gregor was holding them back. And Gregor certainly wasn't aware. But there is that suggestion there. Their strength is sapped, and the injury in Gregor's back began to hurt as much as when it was new. The demise continues. Gregor hardly slept at all, either night or day. Sleep is a necessary endeavor for life. His memories start reflecting on his past. He had long forgotten about his boss and chief clerk, but they would appear again in his thoughts. The salesman and the apprentices, that stupid tea boy, 2 or 3 friends from other businesses, one of the chambermaids from a provincial hotel, a tender memory that appeared and disappeared again. A cashier from a hat shop for whom his attention had been serious but too slow. He's reflecting on his life. And it's also revealing to us that he did have a life outside of work strictly what we came to understand, his routine of just working, coming home, locking himself in his room. Suggestion of romance here. But all these thoughts, all of them appeared to him mixed together with strangers and others he had forgotten. But instead of helping him and his family, they were all of them inaccessible. And he was glad when they disappeared. Right? So we're getting this kind of thought process within Gregor that is focusing on what his life experiences had been. We're again emphasizing Gregor's sister's movement away. Gregor's sister no longer thought about how she could please him, right? But would hardly push some food or other into his room with her foot. And the emphasis, just kick it in there. Before she rushed out to work in the morning, at midday, and in the evening, she would sweep it away with the broom, indifferent as to whether it had been eaten. Remember, before she would share with the family, he ate a bit of this, he didn't. Remember, of course, at the very beginning, when she feeds him, giving him the foods that he liked, and then accommodating and anticipating that his preferences have changed because of his change, and accommodating that. Well, we've seen how much she has changed. Interesting, interesting what transpires here, right? Talking about the sister, at that same time, she became touchy in a way that was quite new for her, in which everyone in the family understood. Cleaning up Gregor's room was for her and her alone. Remember, that was the initial moment when she started taking care of Gregor, that she starts taking on responsibility. She's described before then as being frivolous and not really having responsibilities. And yes, she's very young, at 17 years old. It seemed to be good for her, in a sense, to start taking on responsibilities. And even though now that she no longer cares, seemingly doesn't care about him, she gets very upset if anyone else is going to take over her role as the caregiver to Gregor. And this whole section here, when she gets so upset, but his mother was to be punished still more for what she had done. What did she do? She cleaned the room. As hardly had his sister arrived home in the evening that she noticed the change in Gregor's room, and highly aggrieved, ran back into the living room where, despite her mother's raised and imploring hands, she broke into convulsive tears. This is extraordinarily impactful to the sister, that someone else would. It's not so much the cleaning of the room. It's the imposition on her duties, as she sees it, and responsibilities. Key terms that relate to the idea of how someone should function within a family unit and a societal unit and so on. Giving the sister, by being the caregiver to Gregor, a sense of identity and purpose. We have to question, why is she getting so upset about this? And she's treating it as if her mother took something away from her. And Gregor here hissed in anger that no one had even thought of closing the door to save him from the sight of this and all its noise. So even Gregor is withdrawn. We're seeing this again. Steady progress towards Gregor's demise. We have the charwoman, an interesting character who comes in, is not intimidated by Gregor, which is, interesting insofar as initially, remember how the chief clerk responded when he first sees Gregor. He's horrified. It's a terrifying sight. There's still an intensity to Gregor at the beginning, despite his physical transformation. Maybe the intensity comes from that combination of his lack of physical human attributes, but still a very strong human consciousness. He's now being reduced, that even a stranger who comes in looks and says, what? I'm not even repelled by you. Again, remember that in contrast to the chief clerk, and that scene that we discussed, where he, and the way he backs up and how it's described to us. We see here as well, remember paying attention to the weather, how it's described. One day early in the morning while a heavy rain struck the window panes, and then this little note, perhaps indicating that spring was coming. And we know that because at the end, it is certainly spring-like when they go out. And again, with this charwoman, which is really showing how now Gregor is becoming insignificant. He's not even intimidating anymore. He's becoming a nothing. Becoming just a real bug. Nothing to be scared of. Instead of being afraid, the charwoman just lifted up one of her chairs from near the door and stood there with her mouth open, clearly intending not to close her mouth until the chair in her hand had been slammed down onto Gregor's back. Aren't you coming any closer then? She asked when Gregor turned around again, and she calmly put the chair back. Again, there's a beetle or a cockroach in the room. All I have to do is squash it. It's a big one, so I got a chair, and it seems to be part of the family in some bizarre way, so I'm not going to kill it. But it's no more than just a cockroach now. It doesn't have any impact on her. And now we get Gregor had almost entirely stopped eating. And this comes back to what we discussed in class in terms of whether or not we can see that when it comes to Gregor's death, how much of it was of his own doing. He's not eating. We know, we talked in class how he's not taking care of himself in any way. He's giving up. Is he giving up with a purpose? We don't get that sense. But again, maybe we get a touch of it in that final scene that we have with Gregor. We have the introduction of the three gentlemen tenants. Again, as with the charwomen, they are coming from the outside in. They are representative of the world, right, the society, and they're being brought into the story, and very particularly in one sense to demonstrate the breaking down of the isolation walls, if you will, certainly for the family. Which we know because at the end they are going to go back outside, not inside where they've been cooped up with Gregor. They are at the end going to be going outside into this world. So there's this suggestion that, that world is starting now to become a part of the family, preparing them to make the next move, to go to the next stage. We talked about what these three gentlemen are like, and again, if we're looking at them as a representative of that society, the arrogance of it, the expectations, and of course what we also see here in relation to Gregor's family, as they are now working, as they are now making some kind of a progress, but they're still miserable, and they are subservient. Very obviously to the three gentlemen. They're the tenants. They are waiting hand and foot on these strangers. There's no sense of dignity or pride, elements that one would think, is necessary for, human progress. Take pride in your work. Take pride in who you are. We're not getting that from the family here yet, but we have noticed the changes, that they're working, that their lifestyle has dramatically changed, but seemingly for the worse, in a sense. But again, we have to be reflecting on those multiple layers. How good was their life before, when Gregor took care of everything? They seemed to be good, but what were they actually accomplishing? Even here, when they're miserable, at least their accomplishments are that they are working and they are taking on responsibilities, which they did not have before. There's a time and a need for an adjustment to that, to perhaps recognize its value. And at the same time that that's happening, Gregor is drifting away further and further. We talked about as well how where Gregor lives now is becoming a garbage bin, a room of waste. Gregor's room. Gregor becomes part of that image of waste. Remember, we saw he doesn't clean himself. He's becoming, looking like the room. Like a garbage bin. Anything she couldn't use for the time being, she would just chuck in there. Things of no use. Again, suggesting now that Gregor's usefulness is diminishing. Again, the complexity of what constitutes this usefulness of Gregor. Yes, in a pragmatic way, he was useful because he was paying all the bills and doing all the work. But as I've tried to suggest in class, that was not, on a deeper level, useful to the family, because they have to have their own strengths and abilities and responsibilities. Gregor finds it easy to give up having the door open, something that he wanted before, and now he just goes into the darkest corner of the room. Note how the family is reacting to these people who are in their home. They are letting these three tenants really mistreat them in many respects. You know, checking the food and whether it should be sent back to the kitchen. Let me taste this first. It was to his satisfaction, and Gregor's mother and sister, who had been looking anxious, began to breathe again and smile. Oh my God, thank God he improves. Wow, it's pathetic. You know, yes, they're your tenants, but at the same time, have some dignity. And the family themselves, they just eat in the kitchen. It's their house. They're reduced to eating in the kitchen. That's where the servants eat. That's the state they're in this whole introductory part of the third part. Setup, if you will, for the introduction of the violin and the music. Remember, we talked quite a bit about this, the way that the three gentlemen, right, Greta's playing the music, and the three gentlemen are responding to it, and Gregor's father's like called out, "Is the playing perhaps unpleasant for the gentleman? We can stop it straight away. Do whatever you want." On the contrary, the young lady not like to come in and play for us here in the room where it is, after all, much more cozy and comfortable. All seeming normal to some extent in terms of their appreciation of music. Why not? Oh, we'd love to, you know, but we have to have permission. You know, is this what you want? You sure? Oh, well, yeah. They had never rented out a room before, as we're told here, so they showed an exaggerated courtesy towards the three gentlemen. Did not even dare to sit on their own chairs. Yeah, it's more than that, right? It's a real sense of subverting behavior, and we're certainly, it's emphasized to the point where we really have to take note of it. And of course, then we have what transpires when Gregor hears the music. Right, drawn in by the playing, Gregor had dared to come forward a little and already had his head in the living room. Can't control himself. It's his last grasp at his humanness, his human nature. I mean, and this is the worst time for him to come. There was all the more reason to keep himself hidden as he was covered in the dust that lay everywhere in his room and flew up at the slightest movement. He's become a real hideous figure. He always was, but now add the dust on top and the decrepitness of it all. And at first, of course, no one notices him. And he sees and he feels that the sister is playing so beautifully. And then importantly here, Gregor crawled a little further forward, keeping his head close to the ground so that he could meet her eyes if the chance came. And then this, was he an animal if music could captivate him so? It seemed to him that he was being shown the way to the unknown nourishment he had been yearning for. What is that unknown nourishment that he had been yearning for? When was he yearning for it? Was this the nourishment that he was missing even before his transformation? The nourishment that was necessary for him, the nourishment that he didn't, because he didn't have the nourishment that led to his lack of humanness, or the beginning, or at least partially, and ultimately what's going to lead to his death. And what is this unknown nourishment? Music? He's heard his sister play music before. It's what the music symbolizes, what it represents. And that's left for us to try to ponder. Something is represented in this music that is the nourishment that Gregor needs for survival. And it leads to the imagery, which we talked about in class, where he was imagining his sister living with him. Right? He was determined to make his way forward to his sister and tug at her skirt to show her that she might come into his room with her violin, as no one appreciated her playing there as much as he would. He never wanted to let her out of his room, not while he lived. So the violin is tied into Greta. So we have the music, but we also have Greta. And remember that the relationship that Gregor had with Greta, in any case, was special, at least for Gregor. When he goes on, remember, he was going to send her the conservatory. He has a great love, seemingly, for his sister. But the combination of her playing the violin and his relationship with her, even at this stage of that relationship, seems to be an absolute essential quality that he needs in order to stay remotely human in any way. It's the nourishment. Without nourishment, we die. What is it exactly? We can't know. But something very much related and rooted in the idea of what is human. His shocking appearance should for once be of some use to him. He wanted to be at every door of his room at once and hiss and spit at the attacker. His sister should not be forced to stay with him. This is important. We talked about this. I'm not going to go on to it too much, but it really does play into, when we look at the specificity of his death. His sister should not be forced to stay with him, though, but stay of her own free will. Right? Again, the idea of free will. The freedom to make the decisions and act in ways that would be better for the self and perhaps the family unit, not determined by someone else. Freedom to choose. He insists on that here. We certainly don't get a sense that the family is acting out of free will. They don't want to be doing what they're doing. They feel they've had to do this because of Gregor's condition. They've had to take in tenants. It's not by choice. How he would have told everyone about it last Christmas, sending him to the conservatory. Had Christmas really come and gone already? Another little reference to time. If this misfortune hadn't gotten in the way and refused to let anyone dissuade him from it, on hearing all this, his sister would break out in tears of emotion, and Gregor would climb up to her shoulder and kiss her neck, which, since she had been going out to work, she had kept free without any necklace or collar. It's almost takes on the flavor of eroticism. And it's quite a striking image because he's a giant cockroach kissing his sister's neck. This is what it's tied into this needed nourishment, love. And then, of course, he's discovered. For them, it seemed to think Gregor was more entertaining than the violin playing had been. Right? We noticed that at first they encouraged her, but that the music of the violin does not impact the three gentlemen, but it impacts Gregor. And that really emphasizes this particular human quality in Gregor that's desperately clinging on here. The nourishment that music brings. And of course, we have the whole thing with the way that the gentleman callers react. Remember, they're very rooted in proper behavior. Everything has to be clean, tidy. And of course, this is an abomination in their mind. But they're not running away like the Chief Clark did at the beginning. And even at this point, the sister, is running the pillows and covers on the bed flipper were put into order, and she had already finished making the beds and slipped out again before the three gentlemen had reached the room. They're still like, oh, we can't lose our tenants and this kind of thing. And then the rudeness. I declare here and now, he said, raising his hand and glancing at Gregor's mother and sister to gain their attention too, that with regard to the repugnant conditions that prevail in this flat and with this family, important, right? Condemning the entire family. I give immediate notice on my room. For the days that I have been living here, I will, of course, pay nothing at all. On the contrary, I will consider whether to proceed with some kind of action for damages. Okay, so that scenario plays out, and it's quite a spectacle, quite a scene, and we're seeing again how the family's reaction to it is to try to appease the three gentlemen and to not knowing what to do. No, this seemingly very little concern for Gregor, more concerned for how they are interacting with these very rude, arrogant tenants, indicating that the family, and now we're going to see it in full bloom, and Greta in particular, are ready to say, this is not Gregor. And it's the sister, right? Father, mother said this, his sister hitting the table with her hand is, we can't carry on like this. Maybe you can't see it, but I can. I don't want to call this monster my brother. All I can say is we have to try to get rid of it. We've done all that's humanly possible to look after it and be patient. I don't think anyone could accuse us of doing anything wrong. The mother, right, the father agrees. The mother, who still had not had time to catch her breath, began to cough dully, her hand held in front of her and a deranged expression in her eyes. Right, the sister's saying what they see needs to be said, which does need to be said. Father's in agreement, and the mother's starting to come to that realization. That's why the deranged look, because that's her son. Or is it? And then we have to try to get rid of it. It'll be the death of both of you, she's saying in reference to the father and mother. I can see it coming. We can't all work as hard as we have to and then come home to be tortured like this. We can't endure it. We can't endure it anymore. So noteworthy here, we can't all work as hard as we have to and then come home to be tortured like this. Well, who was working so hard before? And when that person, Gregor, who did all the work, would come home, not that he ever said he was being tortured, but remember, he would go into his room and lock the door. He had no friends, no communication, and seemed to barely communicate with his family other than a little bit with his sister. Is the suggestion here that in this reversal of roles, that they now are doing all the work that Gregor did in the past? And by association, that when she says, when we come home, we torture like this, we can't endure it, is it suggesting that when Gregor would come home after working so hard, that he was being tortured in some kind of way, self-torture perhaps, without even necessarily realizing it? And when she says, we can't endure it, I can't endure it anymore, Gregor couldn't endure it anymore, to the point where he was transformed. Commentary at this point on, in terms of what is endurable and what is it to be human, that the way Gregor was living was intolerable. And now the sisters recognize, now they're in the same boat. We have to do something. Otherwise what? Otherwise, are they going to be transformed into giant insects? Because they are living this tortured life. Again, the hint that this is suggesting that Gregor was living a tortured life. And she spoke out so heavily with tears flowed down her face and so on. The Father, we see now, demonstrating sympathy and understanding. It's not really what we would associate with the Father before. It's just a moment. And then the Father, if he could just understand us, if he could just understand us. And we haven't seen this side of the Father really. We've really associated him more with the aggressor and the uncaring. This seems like genuine anguish. Then perhaps we could come to some kind of arrangement with him. But as it is, the sister interrupts. It's got to go. That's the only way, Father. You've got to get rid of the idea that that's Gregor. And Michi, we talked about this in class, right? If it were Gregor, he would have seen long ago that it's not possible for human beings to live with an animal like that, and he would have just gone of his own free will. Okay? Well, he is about to go. And is he going of his own free will? We wouldn't have a brother anymore then, but we could carry on with our lives and remember him with respect. He's got to go. Again, if we continue with what we're picking up from here, where this reversal of roles, is that perhaps suggesting that Gregor should have been thinking the same thing before he transformed? He should have been able to recognize that his life, the way he was leading it, was unendurable. A life of such anguish that he needed to go then. And while he would have perhaps lost his family because they were so dependent on him, at least he would have been able to remember them with respect. And she takes it to the next level. It obviously wants to take over the whole flat and force us to sleep on the streets. McGregor had no intention of frightening anyone, least of all his sister. We know that. He wants to protect her. But again, the idea of intention, it's an important point as well in the story, is, Gregor's intention was to take care of his family. He had no intention of frightening anyone or hurting anyone. He certainly doesn't have that intention now, and he certainly didn't have that intention before his transformation. But even with good intentions, was he potentially, possibly hurting his family by being there in anguish and hurting himself at the same time? If he had left before his transformation, said, listen, I can't endure this anymore. I'm sorry, but I have to take care of myself. That would have forced the family, something unthinkable, conceivable for Gregor, but it would force them to have to go out and do what they end up doing here anyways. Again, we see this movement towards his death now. They let him slowly get back into his room, and he's thinking again. I remember how he's constantly thinking, oh, look, they're being nice. They understand what I'm trying to do. And then he realizes nothing behind him changed. When he finally gets it, he could not understand how he could recover that distance in his weak state a little while before, and almost without noticing, he concentrated on crawling as fast as he could and hardly noticed that there was not a word, not even a cry from his family to distract him. He did not turn his head until he had reached the doorway. Finally, no one was making him rush anymore. Everything was left up to him. This is his final trek towards death. Only his sister had stood up, and with his last glance, he saw that his mother had now fallen completely asleep before an awakening. He was hardly inside the room before the door was hardly shut, bolted, and locked, and a sudden noise behind Gregor so startled him that his little legs collapsed under him. It was his sister, who had been so much in a rush. She had been standing there waiting and sprung forward lightly. Gregor had not heard her coming at all, and she turned the key in the lock. She said loudly to her parents, "At last." And then we have this heart-wrenching moment. And we'll read it through. And again, because we're asking ourselves, how much is this what he wants now? How much of this is his free will letting go? And then we'll briefly, because we talked about it, look at what happens when he does die. What now then, Gregor asked himself as he looked around in the darkness. He soon made the discovery that he could no longer move at all. This was no surprise to him. It seemed rather that being able to actually move around on those spindly little legs until then was unnatural. He also felt relatively comfortable. It is true that his entire body was aching, but the pain seemed to be slowly getting weaker and weaker and would finally disappear altogether. No more pain. He could already hardly feel the decayed apple in his back or the inflamed area around it, which was entirely covered in white dust. This moment as he is dying is described in ways that are seemingly positive. Pain is leaving. Couldn't feel the decayed apple anymore. He felt relatively comfortable. He thought back of his family with emotion and love. If it was possible, he felt that he must go away even more strongly than his sister. He remained in this state of empty and peaceful rumination until he heard the clock tower strike 3 in the morning, back to time. 3, again tied into the theological 3 being the Trinity, and then there's all kinds of significance to the number 3 noticeable here. He watched as it slowly began to get light everywhere outside the window too. We haven't seen much light. It's been rainy, foggy, dark, damp. Then, without his willing it, just to get us thinking again about free will. But this is saying without his willing it, his head sank down completely and his last breath flowed weakly from his nostrils. Oh, no, that solves it. No, it's not free will. He didn't do it willingly. Is it that obvious? It just seems to be, adding more confusion of sorts. The only thing for certain here is that he's dead. Was it peaceful? Was it a release? Was it a relief? Get all the indications that it was. Relief for him. Letting go. But note how it is for the rest of the family. Everything changes after this. Everything was working towards this. They'd gotten jobs. They recognized their predicament. They knew they had to do something. They seemed incapable of doing it. They were miserable. But with Gregor's death, suddenly, now they have the ability. And this is where we see the father in particular. We've seen the transformation of the daughter. We've seen the transformation of the mother to some degree. But this is where we really see the father suddenly. And it is rather sudden. But we saw a taste of it there when he's expressing his sympathy. If only he could understand us. Compassion. Sympathy. or just selfishness? First thing, and again, this area, we covered this a lot, so I'm going to be starting to wrap it up here. Again, he's, he should just a shove with the broom. I was just pointing out in class, someone was saying, he's flat. He's like a bug that had been dead for a long time. It's not alive. It's just a thing. And again, Mr. Samson, let's give thanks. Now then, said Mr. Samson, let's give thanks to God for that. Right? So that again ties into the free will. Was this God? Thank God, God killed him? God's responsible for Gregor's death? Was Gregor responsible with his free will for the death? Was it a combination thereof? It doesn't give us answers. It's more how they perceive it. Certainly the Father is saying, let's give thanks to God. God has come to our rescue. God has relieved us of this burden. This is a good thing. But how do we feel when Gregor dies here? Do we think it's a good thing? Maybe we do. As heartbreaking as it is. Maybe he has peace now. And then we get this. Just look how thin he is. He didn't eat anything for so long. Well, if he's not eating, then is that him consciously choosing to head towards death? Nourishment. That's not the kind of nourishment he needed. It was that other kind, the kind associated with the music and the love that he had with Greta. And we find out now is already the end of March after all. Spring. And here we see the Father now in his uniform. Remember, we talked about the uniform just a little while ago, but now the uniform, what we associate with the uniform, takes shape. The lightness of the room, right? Notice the whole atmosphere has changed because of, or as a result of, or certainly after Gregor's death. And now, while he's in his uniform, leave my home now. We haven't seen the Father act like this with anyone other than Gregor. We saw how subservient he was to the gentleman and so on. Now, what do you mean? Asked the middle of the three gentlemen. So, well, you can't talk to me like that. Well, yeah, I can. Beat it. You're done here. I'm now finally doing and what I need to do and taking on my proper role. We haven't seen that before. I mean just what I said. And he's doing this for his family. He's not doing this because he's upset or angry at Gregor when we saw him being assertive there. No, this is a very different type of assertion. And it just shatters the three men, right? Not what they anticipated. Didn't spend much time, and there's much that could be said, but what those three men come to represent, again, three, right? And do they represent the real world on the outside? But what else could that be? That could be explored. Again, another layer. We just don't have time to look at every possible layer that the story provides for us. But how these three get broken up as a result of this. Then the whole thing, we need a break from work. Ties in again to what we were saying earlier about, we can't live like this. We can't endure this kind of workload. Same thing could have applied to Gregor before his transformation, but there was no one there to help and advise him, hey, you can't do that, because he was being ignored. He was truly alone. The family unit now, these three are not. They have each other, and the Father is taking charge. Now the Father is taking on the role that he was, or society deems, or maybe human nature deems, is the proper role. They had to take a break from work. Everyone write your letters. We're going to write letters to excuse ourselves from work because we need a day. I remember Gregor getting a day. And he'd been doing it for 5 years, not 5 months. And I'm going to get rid of the charwoman. You know, the charwoman who says, don't worry, I'll take care of the body, whatever it is. It's an insignificant thing now. What it represented. But once it's gone, once he's gone, once everything that Gregor represents is gone, and the father takes charge in the image of, the three of them walking together, getting rid of the tenants, taking charge. Salvation, a kind of resurrection. Tonight she gets sacked. The charwoman seemed to have destroyed the peace they had only just gained. Unacceptable. Can't allow interference here to disrupt who we are anymore. Get rid of it. Going to move into a smaller house, a manageable house, a house that would be appropriate for the three of us. They get outside and took the tram out to the open country outside the town. They had the tram filled with warm sunshine, all to themselves, a unit all to themselves. Went back comfortably on their seats. They discussed their prospects and found that on closer examination, they were not at all bad. Until then, they had never asked each other about their work, but all three had jobs, which were very good and held particularly good promise for the future. They didn't just get the jobs after Gregor died. But they weren't, as it says, but they had never even asked each other about it. Now they can. Gregor's death allows for it. Gregor's sacrifice allows his family to live. And that which Gregor was always concerned about, doing the right thing for his family, ultimately he does through his death. The greatest improvement for the time being, of course, would be achieved quite easily by moving house. What they needed now was a flat that was smaller and cheaper than the current one, which had been chosen by Gregor, one that was in a better location, and most of all, more practical. Ooh, just a little dig there. Practical. Practical according to the norms of society. Is that the only way we can function? Where has that nourishment that the music represented? Do they need that same kind of nourishment? Was it only Gregor who needed that kind of nourishment? All the time, Greta was becoming livelier, live. With all the worry they had been having of late, her cheeks had become pale. But while they were talking, Mr. and Mrs. Sampson were struck almost simultaneously with the thought of how their daughter was blossoming into a well-built and beautiful young lady. They became quieter, just from each other's glance and almost without knowing it. They agreed that it would soon be time to find a good man for her. And as if in confirmation of their new dreams and good intentions, as soon as they reached their destination, Greta was the first to get up and stretch out her young body. Yeah, how do we reconcile? I remember in class, and I asked you when you'd finished it, whenever most people who spoke expressed, so sad and disturbing. And then, as I pointed out and reminded, but look at this ending. This is so full of promise and hope. And then maybe we go, yeah, so maybe it is hopeful. Gregor's sacrifice for his family, and his family is so. But is that? Because we are impacted by Gregor's death. How are we dealing with this ending? Is it just fine to be practical? Do we look at it like Gregor made the ultimate sacrifice to save his family? Or is there something a little more sinister going on here? Is this salvation? Is this redemption? Is this hope? A kind of a practical idea of hope? But is it nourishment? The kind of nourishment that Gregor was talking about in relation to the music of the violin. All right, that is us wrapping up the Metamorphosis. If you have questions or concerns, of course, bring it up in our next class, though we will be getting started with Billy Budd and Melville. Okay? See you in the classroom on Thursday, of those of you who will be coming. Okay, and as I posted, though I'm sure you saw it, but I'll just remind you, if you're not able to make it to the classroom, you'll still be able to access the class through Omnibus Zoom. All right, everyone. We'll see you in class or at class.